What's up, boxing fans? This is TBE Boxing back at you again. Today's topic: declining viewership and attendance, forcing boxing doubleheader for Errol Spence and Jamel Charlo. Let's chop it up and see what it's all about.
Got the money for minutes, pretty bitch, gotta show me titties. This is the life that I chose, huh? On the block with the pole, huh? This is the life that I chose, huh? On the block with the pole, huh? That life for riches, huh? That life for riches, huh? Pretty bitch, show me titties, huh? And I got the glizzy, run up on me, I'ma make you get it. I'ma make you get it.
Okay, boxing fans, let's talk some boxing. We're gonna chop it up today. All right, so a couple of fights coming up soon this summer. We have Jamel Charlo versus Brian Castano, 154 pounds for the undisputed title. We also have Yordenis Ugas versus Errol Spence for unified at 147 pounds. Now, both of these fights are coming up back to back. I think one was supposed to be in June and the other in July, if I'm not, or both in July, if I'm not mistaken. But we've been hearing talk that these fights are they're going to do doubleheader for this fight. They're going to put both of these fights in the same card. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is, why would that be? I mean, you would think that undisputed at 154 pounds, between Jamel Charlo and Brian Castano would be by itself, would be able to stand on its own. And, also a fight between, the so-called pay-per-view star Errol Spence and, Yordenis Ugas would be able to stand on its own. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem, that is the case, because they're talking about doing a doubleheader. And usually when you do a doubleheader, you're trying to increase value for the buck, okay? So you want to give the people more value for what they're spending. And so they're talking about doing a doubleheader. And we're going to examine the reasons why that might be the case. Why would they do a doubleheader with such supposedly big fights? Each of these fights are supposed to be big fights, by themselves and should be able to stand on their own, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And, now, the last time they did a doubleheader, it was with the Charlos. Both Charlos fought on that card. It was a pretty good card. But unfortunately, the pay-per-view numbers was less than spectacular, to say the least. From what I'm hearing about that fight, the pay-per-view numbers was under 100,000 buys, okay? And that was a doubleheader with both Charlos. So it would seem that the Charlos are not exactly what you'd call pay-per-view stars, quote-unquote, which is a very overused word in today's environment, especially with the pandemic going on. We hear talk about pay-per-view stars, but there's very few pay-per-view stars currently, when it comes to boxing. We probably, because routinely these guys in boxing are getting maybe 200, and nobody is cracking 400,000 pay-per-views, okay, currently in the boxing, unless we're talking about the Roy Jones, Mike Tyson, and that Jake Paul, Nate Robinson fight, which did over 1 million pay-per-view buys. And that one fight was an exhibition and the other was just a YouTube fight. So we having basically YouTube fights and exhibitions doing better than real boxers who are in their prime and who's boxing currently. So how can you call a boxer a pay-per-view star when they're not cracking 400,000 and you got exhibition fighters and YouTubers routinely cracking 1 million pay-per-view buys? So something is wrong there. So again, a lot of people out there are calling Errol Spence a pay-per-view star. He hasn't cracked 400,000 pay-per-view buys to this day. And like I said, Jake Paul and Mike Tyson and Roy Jones cracked 1 million pay-per-view buy with the exhibition. So who's the real pay-per-view star? If Errol Spence is a pay-per-view star and he's only doing 350,000 pay-per-view buys, and then you have Mike Tyson and Jake Paul doing over a million pay-per-view buys. Who's the real pay-per-view star? So we see it for what it is. So there's no real pay-per-view stars out there right now in boxing because, again, you have MMA and UFC fights. You're routinely getting 700, 800,000, a million pay-per-view buys for their fights. You know, like in the Usman fight, and you know, these guys are making going close to a million pay-per-view buys, and in some cases over a million pay-per-view buys, while boxing pay-per-view numbers continue to decline. Okay, and you know, we can use. So let's use Errol Spence as an example. In his fight with Mikey Garcia, and I want to caution people that, you know, sometimes these numbers that we see for these pay-per-view numbers, they're pretty basically, you know, they're fudging the numbers, you know, saying more. I mean, most of the time you're hearing these numbers, you know, the numbers are being fudged in the sense that they're inflating the numbers. You know, so for example, they might say a fight did 260,000 pay-per-view by when it actually did under 300,000. And so, you know, that's basically the case in a lot of these boxing matches, because the numbers have been declining so precipitously that, you know, they have to fudge the numbers to make it look good. But anyway, that is what it is. All right, so let's use Errol Spence as an example. So if we look at Errol Spence's recent fights, he did supposedly 360,000 pay-per-view buys with Mikey Garcia. Okay. His next fight after that was with Sean Porter, and that did a reported 300,000 pay-per-view buys. Okay. And then his next fight with Danny Garcia, after that, that did a reportedly 250,000 pay-per-view buys. So as you can see, Errol Spence's numbers have been declining from the Mikey Garcia to Danny Garcia by at least 50,000 pay-per-view buys each time he fought. Okay, so his most recent fight did the lowest. Now, the fight with Danny Garcia, that fight was expected to do 600 to 700 pay-per-view buys from the network. This is what the networks expected from that fight. But like I said, the fight barely cracked 250,000. It probably did around 200,000 if we were to look at the real numbers. Okay, so let's just say that wasn't exactly what the networks were looking for. Like I said, they were, forecasting 600 to 700,000. So to say that they were disappointed would be an understatement, because the fight barely did a third of what they forecasted the fight to do. So as we can see, Errol Spence's numbers have been declining. Okay, and if we look at Jermell Charlo, like I said, his numbers was never high in the first place. Not that Errol Spence's numbers are high, but Jermell Charlo's numbers with the doubleheader with his brother was even lower than Errol Spence's numbers, and that was a doubleheader. So those numbers are very low. Now, if we look at the fight, in terms of Brian Castano and Yordenis Ugas, they barely have any following in terms of pay-per-view buys, and I don't think any of these guys have been in a pay-per-view fight. So if we look at these fights separately, I don't think that the numbers are going to do very well if these fights were to happen on their own. Now, in the case of Jermell Charlo and Brian Castano, we can see that fight is not going to really do well pay-per-view wise, because nobody really knows Jermell Charlo like that unless you're, the casual boxing fan I'm talking about. I mean, the boxing community and people that's in boxing know these guys very well. Okay, I know that these guys are great fighters. However, the casual fan, the people that's going to spend the money for the pay-per-view, they don't really know these guys that well. Or they don't know a Jermell Charlo and even less know a Brian Castano. So, Brian Castano is from Argentina. People in his country might know him, but Argentinians have not really been, that known in the boxing community, for supporting their fighters. They're more known like in MMA, but in boxing, not that much. But anyway, so if we look at that fight, Jermell Charlo versus Castano for Undisputed, even though it's a huge fight, to the boxing aficionado, people that follow boxing, it's not that huge of a fight, that big of a fight to the general public or to the casual fans. So a lot of people are not even going to know about that fight, okay, unless they do some massive promotion, which, these in the boxing is not really known for that. So that fight, there's not much demand for it, as you know, from the public, because these guys are not known, and so that fight probably won't do that well in pay-per-view. If we look at the Errol Spence or Dennis Ugas fight, as another fight, you know, I mean, Errol Spence is somewhat known, but he's not, like I said, as I demonstrated, he's not really a pay-per-view star. Has his fanboys and, you know, these LDBC guys out there, you know, they keep saying he's a pay-per-view star, but in reality, he's not. And not only is he not a pay-per-view star, he's far from being a pay-per-view star. Okay, so that fight is not going to do great numbers because not many people even know who Yordenis Ugas is, and so the only person that's going to be known in that fight is Errol Spence, and so he doesn't. Errol Spence in the case of this fight doesn't really have a known dancing partner to boost the pay-per-view buy. Okay, so that fight is probably not going to do that well, and not only that, there's not much of a demand for that fight. Okay, nobody's really looking, you know, to see Ugas fight Spencer. Nobody was calling for that fight. It just so happens that Yordenis Ugas got awarded the belt that was stripped from Manny Pacquiao. So now he's a champ, and now Errol Spence wants to get that belt. And so that fight is happening out of necessity more than anything else. There's no demand for it per se. Okay, so that fight probably won't do that well either. And I'm pretty sure it's going to do less than the Danny Garcia Errol Spence fight. So you can see, based on, you know, what's going on, that why they would have a double header. Okay, because both of these fights are expected to do not to do very well in pay-per-view numbers, and you know, which necessitates them doing a double header to try and boost the viewership, because you know, Errol Spence's numbers, you know, has been declining, like I said, and you know, nobody wants to see Errol Spence do a fight with Ugas and it becomes a pay-per-view flop, which is probably what it's going to be on its own. And so is the Jermell Charlo Castano fight. They both are going to flop if they were to happen by themselves, or they're going to expose, you know, that the fact that Errol Spence doesn't really have that much of a following, or doesn't really have he's not really a big pay-per-view draw if they have to depend on just Errol Spence alone, okay, to carry the fight. You know, he's not going to be able to carry the fight in terms of high numbers. And so nobody wants to expose him, or the PBC doesn't want to expose him, you know, on that level. And so they decide that they're going to put together a double header to see if they can get, you know, higher viewership for you know, for both of these fights, which is a smart move on their part, I would think. And so, you know, that might create more buzz and, you know, bring in more viewership for the fights, you know, to put Jermell Charlo and Errol Spence on the same card. Now, it should do good, fairly well, if they promote it, okay? But if they don't promote it, it's not going to do that well, I don't believe. So, you know, that's where I see this situation with this, you know, with these fights are. So, and on top of that, you know, we have to understand something else as well. Errol Spence has been losing a lot of luster, or his name or his brand has lost a lot of luster due to the fact that, you know, he's being perceived as avoiding Terence Crawford, which is a fight that is actually in demand, you know, and the casual fan would come out and see that fight, and a lot of people have been calling for that fight. And Errol Spence has basically more or less, you know, avoided that fight for the past 3 years. Terence Crawford has been calling him out, chasing the fight. And it's to the point now where Terence Crawford has decided that he's done with chasing Errol Spence and he's not going to call for the fight anymore. And even if there was to, you know, ask him about the fight or to offer him the fight at a 50-50 split, he probably wouldn't go for the fight, he said, okay? Because as you all know previously, one of the ways that Errol Spence has been using to avoid the fight has been talking about he wants a 60-40 split, 70-30 split, 80-20 split, or whatever he decides to give Crawford. Before that, it was that Crawford was on the other side of the street. You know, before that, you know, Crawford should leave Top Rank and come to PBC. And, you know, different excuses like that he's been using to avoid the fight. So at this point, you know, Terence Crawford has become frustrated, with trying to get that fight and decide that he's not going to chase that fight anymore, and that he doesn't even want to talk about that fight anymore. So since that has happened, there's been a lot of as a matter of fact, there's even more talk about the fight now that Terence Crawford has said that he's not really interested in that fight anymore. Now people are constantly talking about Errol Spence versus Crawford, and that is that fight going to happen? But the bottom line is that, again, the fact that that fight is not happening, or hasn't happened yet, and the fact that Errol Spence has been avoiding that fight, and now we have Terence Crawford say he's not even interested in that fight anymore, it has caused Errol Spence to lose a lot of luster in terms of his brand, and so declining viewership, because the fight that people wanted to see Errol Spence in is that fight, Errol Spence and Terence Crawford, and they're not seeing it, they're not getting it, and so they're not very happy with that, and so that has put a hit on Errol Spence in terms of viewership, and we have seen, like I said, his viewership declining in his past couple of fights. So it is what it is. So this doubleheader, I guess, is a way to combat, the declining viewership, which is a smart move, again, like I said previously, because not only is it smart, but it's necessary, because, again, like I already stated, each fight was not going to do well for the reasons that I just gave you. Okay, they're not going to do well on their own, so they need to put them together, and it's a smart move, and I think it's smart of them to do that. All right, so this is something they're talking about. We're not really sure they're actually going to do it, but I would think that they will do that, because, like I said, even though we've been talking about these two fights, there's not seem to be much interest out there in these fights, actually. People, like I said, in the boxing community is talking about it, but in the general public, nobody really knows about this fight. Nobody's talking about these fights, and what they're talking about is Errol Spence versus Terence Crawford, and we already know that at this point it doesn't look like that fight is going to happen, and so the people out there in the boxing public are pretty disappointed in that. Not just the boxing public, but the boxing community as well. They're pretty disappointed. The networks, they wanted that fight as well, but no one could convince Errol Spence to take the fight for 50-50, and so it is what it is. And right now, it doesn't look like that fight is going to happen anytime soon. So I guess we're going to have to wait and see how this boxing doubleheader, if it becomes a boxing doubleheader, turns out. It should be interesting. I'm looking forward to these fights, because I think they're interesting fights, on their own. And, there's a bit of uncertainty in these fights. A lot of people thinking that Errol Spence is going to wash Yordenis Ugas. I'm not of that opinion. I don't, style make fights, and Ugas could prevent a problem for Errol Spence. I'm not saying that's going to be the case, but it's a possibility, and so we have to see how the fight play out to see what's going to happen. Anything could happen, I would think, and I'm not of the opinion that Errol Spence is going to automatically win the fight, against Ugas. We saw how Ugas performed against Sean Porter in their fight that he lost barely, and it was a very good performance. So we have to see how he fares against a guy like Errol Spence, when they're actually in the ring. In the case of Jermell Charlo and Brian Castano, that should be a great fight. As you know, Brian Castano is a perpetual motion fighter who continues to come forward. He's going to be in there fighting every minute of every round, and we all know Jermell Charlo has the skill that pays the bills. So that should be an interesting fight. Okay, Jermell Charlo is no joke in there. He's a elite fighter. Has a great record in terms of what he's accomplished in boxing. At this point, he's the 3-belt unified champion, and now he's going to try for undisputed. But again, that fight, it could go either way, I would think. Brian Castano might surprise us. You never know. He fought a draw with he fought to a draw with Eris Landis Laura, and he beat Texera for the belt. I mean, and it's not out of the realm of possibility that he could, you know, defeat Jermell Charlo. I mean, it's possible. It's not likely, but it is possible. Okay, but anyway, both of these fights should be interesting fights. But again, the reason they're going to be a doubleheader is because of the declining viewership, I would think, and so they might decide to do a doubleheader. But we'll see how it plays out in the end. But I'm going to leave it there for right now. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. Go to tbeboxing.com and, you know, buy some of my merchandise. Support the channel, okay? Make sure you like, make sure you subscribe, make sure you share the video. This is TBE Boxing. That's all I have for right now. I'm out.